Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to We the People Let's Talk by George. This is George. I'm curious, inquisitive. Today's topic, in fact, it's episode 3 for season 2, is going to be about school choice, but we're going to focus mainly on classical education. I do have a guest to my left, and that's a good friend of mine. His name is Mr. Mark Gotz. That's G-O-T-Z. You got that? You got that, Gotz? Mark,
Yes,
I'm
George.
glad that you were able to make it here.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're quite welcome, you know. It's only a natural thing for me to invite people of your stature, okay? Anyhow, give me some background. I know you're the founder of American Classical Charter Academy. What kind of background and experience do you have relative to this classical education thing?
Well, classical education I actually ran into about 5 years ago. At least a format that was, I thought, the best I'd ever seen. And I've been looking at education for about 30 years, starting in Coral Springs, Florida, where my children went to a great string of schools, elementary, middle, and high school, quality schools, and got a great education.
Was it all public, or was it
It was
classic,
all public. It was all
classic
public.
oriented?
Yeah, no, it was all public. And like I say, they got a good education there. But one of the things that kind of I was introduced to with them going to school there was the music programs that they were in, because they were all very good at music, but they were very good at music because in elementary school they had a elementary music teacher who taught them all the basics of music, how to read notes, how to count, staffs, everything else.
Did they go into harmony and theory and things of that sort?
I would imagine they did. They had some times where they'd be playing instruments as they got into 3rd and 4th grade. So with that basic knowledge of music, they then went forward to middle school. And the middle school band conductors there were getting some really good product. A lot of them, they would have 2 classes. One would be for the beginners, and then they'd have this intermediate class that was basically coming from this elementary school that was down the street. And so these teachers had these students who had such a great basic knowledge in music that now they could take them into the next level.
And what was that?
That was even marching in middle school. They had them
In middle
marching
school?
in middle school.
That's unheard of.
It was fascinating that they actually would march in middle school. And so obviously that created the base and foundation for them as they moved into high school. And they went to high school at J.P. Taravella in Coral Springs. And at that time, J.P. Taravella had 28 years of consecutive superiors at the FBA marching. And so one of the reasons for this was this basic foundation that the students got in elementary school, that was expanded in middle school, and then was even promoted to a higher level in high school. And what they did in high school was off the charts. But in any event, it showed the logical progression of education in an area, in this case music. So I found the Mason Academy over in Collier County in Naples, and had been exploring, looking for different quote-unquote silver bullets. And I had looked at schools such as the A.D. Henderson School on the FAU campus in Boca Raton, which has been there for 50 years now, and been one of the top schools for the last 50 years too in the state. And looked at what their programs were and what they did. At that time they had a K-8 that only had 478 stations in the school. And at that time, they had a 6,000 student waiting list.
6,000?
6,000, yes.
And this was years ago, huh?
This is mid to late 90s. So they obviously had a program that would be replicated and would want to be replicated, although it was a university lab school. And in 1960s, there were 4 university lab schools created in this state specifically to find new and better ways to deliver education to students. And this one school was in Boca Raton, and they were fortunate that they had a campus near them of a very large company that was expanding called IBM. And IBM was working on software at that time and needed a place to experiment their software with students. And of course, the A.D. Henderson School, being a lab school, was the perfect match. So back in the early 70s, A.D. Henderson had 10 computers in every classroom. Most colleges didn't have that back then. So the school progressed very well and has been an exceptional school and still is today. They added a high school to it. But this led me to eventually get over to the Mason Academy, which is a charter school in Naples, Florida, that is a classical education school, a Barney Hillsdale school, and watching the presentation of their elementary school. I was able to spend some time in there, see the teachers and the students interact. And in classical education, it's a different type of interaction. Public schools, you basically, you're told what to do, here's what you got to follow, you got to go fill this form out or do this paper or whatever. In classical education, it's more of a conversation.
Yeah, we'll get deeper into that, okay? But I just want to hear your background and experience and how you got into this whole thing about classical education and becoming a founder, okay?
Oh, well, that is just looking for better ways to educate students and give them a better education. There's so much going on today about how poorly our public education system is.
My gosh. Elizabeth, here's a big one. Okay, go on.
But with that, the question is, all right, so everybody's identified the problem, but nobody comes up with the solution. And the solution has to be a better format of delivery. And of course, for 3,500 years, they've used classical education to train everybody from Einstein to the greatest minds in the world over that period of time. And so why wouldn't that continue to be the best way to educate, as it is? And so classical education is a renaissance of that primary way to educate, which, the progressives came in the late 1890s with Dewey, and they started messing with the system. And then, of course, as we got into the early 1900s, you had Woodrow Wilson, and the government started taking over the education systems in this country, which, if you follow our Constitution, you will not find the word education anywhere in the Constitution of the United States.
How true, how true.
So they're overstepping their grounds, but that all goes back to unions and money, and education is like anything else. If you follow the money in education, you'll see where it goes, and we can discuss that if you want to. But basically, education is the second highest producer to our gross domestic product. Medicine is number one, education is number two. So it's a big money business, and a lot of people are having a good time participating.
Well, let me talk about the classical process or the curriculum, okay? We know we go back to the Greeks, to the Romans, so on and so forth, and we go through the centuries and everything else, go through the Dark Ages, the medieval times, okay? And then we go into the Renaissance, and we go into Reformation, then we go into the Enlightenment, okay? So let's talk about what the Greeks and Romans contributed in terms of the classical education curriculum. Tell me.
Well, I mean, if you go back to the great thinkers and the great educators, which were Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, that line of educators were there to pass on knowledge. And that was basically the only way to pass on knowledge at that point in time, was through interaction and the conversation. We talk about the great conversation.
So we're talking about the Socratic method being applied, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And also some of the greats, the classics, if you want to call them, in terms of philosophers, so on and so forth. We have beyond Aristotle, we have Homer, we have Virgil, the Iliad and the Odyssey, okay, so on and so forth. The Aeneid, so on and so forth. That is fantastic in terms of giving background, a foundation to understand things that people were confronted with as they were growing up. All right, now we're talking about Greeks and Romans, what they contributed. What I'm trying to think, what was it? The three ways, okay? The trivium, okay, and the quadrivium, okay.
Right.
Can you explain that?
Certainly.
And where it came from?
The trivium, which came from that era of Greek education was basically the three main things that were educating the masses at that point in time, because they were somewhat of a republic. And the Trivium is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And they're taught at certain periods of time in the education of a child. Because a child, as they grow up, when they're young, they're like sponges. They just take in everything. So the first thing that you want to focus on is getting them to have mastery of the language. The mastery of the language allows them to dissect words, dissect sentences, understand the meaning of words at a very young age. And so over their grammar period, what we used to call grammar school, which is now elementary school, they would be learning through those years to communicate in their language, to read, to write, and understand the language. That was the grammar portion. Then as they grew older and got into their early teens, that would be the middle school, or the logic portion, which is the best time in a student's life to learn logic, is when their body is changing and when they're having all of these different things going on and they start to ask a lot of questions. Well, that's what logic is about. It's taking a particular item, looking at it, discussing it, raising questions about it, and then trying to answer those questions. So it's an answer, a question, an answer, constantly back and forth in a conversation.
And within logic and everything, it's a process of reasoning. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right.
To understand the particular issue, and then to logically look at it and dissect it. Now, from that standpoint, you then go into rhetoric, which is the final stage, which incorporates that foundation, like I spoke about in music, with the middle school, the logic, and now in the rhetoric portion of it, it's the ability to communicate your position on an issue.
You mentioned rhetoric, okay, and that makes me laugh because a lot of these politicians, and I don't care what party they're affiliated, use a lot of rhetoric, okay? It's words, it's sentences, statements, and everything else, but there's no really motivation or anything like that. They're trying to be persuasive, I guess. Mm-hmm. Okay, anyhow, continue.
Well, that's what rhetoric is.
Yeah.
It's persuasion, it's a position. And so the ability to discuss and argue points back and forth is all part of that rhetoric, which comes from understanding language. So you can read and understand and drill down and find out about things, then form logical opinions about them, and then express those opinions and argue those opinions if need be. So that is a classical education format.
And where does the quadrivium come into play? How does it interact or interface with that?
The quadrivium comes in and adds four pieces to the trivium.
And what is that?
That is astronomy, geometry, music, and the fourth one I can't remember. But that forms the trivium.
Arithmetic.
There
we go.
That is
Okay.
the fourth
There
one.
you
Thank
go.
you. You know, I always think of when you have geometry, I consider that a form of arithmetic, but that is true. Arithmetic and then geometry. So that was an extension for the citizens who were wanting to get more educated into specific fields. I mean, when you look at geometry, that was the basis for the great architects who did all the great architecture during the Renaissance periods. When you see that all comes from the basic education and then the extension with the quadrivium.
So if you combine all these seven, they would be equivalent to the 7 arts?
Probably
3
pretty
and
close.
4?
You know, I find most of them are mental things except for music. Now, why was music one of the 7? Because music is something that can internally move you in many different ways. So consequently, music was the one thing that could actually get into the body. Everything else was to create something in the mind for reasoning, but music was the basis of maybe more passion and more
Well, music
feelings.
can be very emotional, okay?
It can.
And that could be an outlet for bringing out those, or relieving those tensions, okay? And you wouldn't really have to use a thinking process. It's just for enjoyment.
Well, you also had, when you went into war, you had a bugler, you had somebody who would play a music to communicate with everybody as to what needed to be done at that point in time.
I'm thinking of James Cagney.
And
This is
which,
going to
which
World War
movie
One,
now?
and I can't remember. Tell me.
Yankee Doodle
Yankee
Dandy?
Doodle Dandy. Yes,
Okay.
yes. Okay.
we go through this all the time.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
It's one of those things. Great movie.
Fantastic movie. Anyhow, let's move on. A lot of individuals are saying nowadays, okay, teaching of Latin, okay, is antiquated, archaic. Why should we deal with the dead language?
Well,
Why is it that Latin was the basis of learning and still should be?
Well, you go back to dissecting sentences, dissecting words, etc. 80% of our languages have a Latin base.
No.
So, if you learn Latin, you have the basic roots of most of the languages that are spoken in the world today. So that helps you obviously understand different languages, even if you're not astute in the language. That's why Latin.
So you think there's a revival, a resurrection of utilizing Latin to go back to the root of these Romance languages and other languages?
Well,
that we use?
if you want to educate your students. You see, the question here is if you want to educate your students. In a classical format like we have at American Classical Charter Academy, our main objective is to educate our students. We don't have any other objectives.
You don't tell them what to think?
We don't tell them what to think.
You're
we
into
try to
critical
teach them
thinking?
how to think.
How to think?
We just want
That's
we
a
want
lost
them to know
art,
how to
isn't
think. That is, but that is the basis of what we do there. And you know, we're seeing a situation where parents are treated like terrorists now. If they go to a school board
Well, aren't
meeting,
they? If they question how their students are or kids, siblings are taught?
Apparently, according to the Attorney General of the United States, that's a problem. We invite our parents in. We believe that parents are part of the learning triangle. And that learning triangle is the teacher, the student, and the parent. That's how students learn well, and that's how parents know that their students are learning and not just being babysat.
So we don't have a PTO, like a parent-teachers organization. What do we have instead?
Well, we have a parent school participation. In other words, the parents participate in the school, and that's a participation they do, not a parent-teacher organization, which is a different national type organization that you would join.
So they come onto the premises as volunteers?
Oh, yes.
What do they do?
As a matter of fact, we have an enormous amount of parents who have gone through a process that they have to be cleared to become volunteers be able to come on the school grounds as volunteers. So we've got like 80 volunteers, out of 350 students, which is, almost 25% of our parents are qualified and background checked volunteers.
I'm concerned about this, and I use the shotgun effect when I deal with education or anything I talk about. When they teach history, okay, especially U.S. history, I know that they raise the flag. All the 300-something odd students come out early in the morning, like 7:50, 7:55. And what do? How does that add to citizenship?
Well, it starts the day. Basically, we start the day with raising the flag, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and saying the preamble to the Constitution.
You've got to be kidding.
No.
Why the preamble?
Why the
I mean, the
preamble
kids
Constitution?
in kindergarten are actually reciting the preamble?
That's correct.
That's unheard of. Why?
Well, because what we try to do at American Classical Charter Academy is the whole child from a standpoint of creating better citizens. And to be a better citizen, you have to understand the instruments that are part of your government. Constitution being the supreme law of the land, always has been, always will be, as long as people focus on looking at the Constitution as that, the supreme law of the land, and not trying to go around it or go through it. And so we need to teach that with our students. Pledge of Allegiance, you hear a lot of talk about we're in a democracy. Well, we're not in a democracy. If anybody who knows the Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic.
It's a constitutional republic, right?
It's a constitutional republic, absolutely. It's not a democracy.
Yeah.
They had a democracy in France where the guillotine was invented and they took care of those who didn't agree. But that's another story.
I picture like Madame Defarge knitting and everything else, off with their heads, okay? let's talk more about the change, though. We have progressives coming in, like Horace Mann, okay, back in the 1800s. John Dewey. Do you think they actually distorted, ruined, or they said they were progressives? They had to adapt to what was going on at that time, okay, the Industrial Revolution. And then we set aside the classical education. So tell me what you're feeling.
Well, the problem there is they started grouping. They started grouping people into an industrialized situation. They felt they had to create workers that would fit into the manufacturing, the Industrial Revolution that was going on, instead of creating thinkers. Because you can have those people working in those factories, and if they have the ability to think and look and logically think, then basically they become better workers. They didn't believe in that. They just believed that you needed specific skills, and that's all you needed to be a part of the Industrial Revolution. Well, it's it's proven over time, because the Industrial Revolution now is past, and we're now in the Communications Revolution. Independent people who can think and logically look at what goes on in the world are somewhat of a problem to the progressives, because the progressives are nothing more than communists. This is the Communist Chinese Party.
How dare you say that?
It's the
what
Russian
fact
Communist Party.
that?
On history. If you look at how they took out the czars in Russia, if you look at how they took out the Kuomintang in China, which was the basic Chinese Nationalist Party, it's the same pattern. You divide and conquer. So they're doing that in the schools with things like creative CRT, creative race theory.
Okay, what about white supremacy, white privilege? That's all part of this?
Well, I'd like to see that proven someplace in this country, because there's no evidence of white supremacy in this country.
Well, according to what, Project 1619, there is.
Well, 1619, CRT, DEI, these are all communist ideas of how to divide us up as a society, because they can't have us as one constant society. That creates too big of a effort for them to conquer. So they come up with these fairy tales, what I call communist fairy tales, which they press on as progressive because somebody doesn't have justice. The social justice that they talk about is nothing more than a communist thing that was there in Russia in 1917 and that was there in China in 1949.
Right, let me go on to this.
Okay.
This is a great book, right? It's called Introduction to Classical Education, a Guide for Parents by Perrin.
By Perrin. Very good guide, very short read, and very to the point. It explains classical education. People think that classical education is basically direct education, but it's not. It's not just the teacher in front, the sage on the stage, as they like to say. It's a conversation. Done well, like it was in Mason Academy that I saw in Naples, it is back and forth between students and teacher on an ongoing basis.
And I've heard comments about individuals making fun of, ridiculing classical education, saying it was too harsh, too disciplined. And what's wrong with that?
Well, I don't know. If you look at discipline, I think that's probably one of the biggest factors between the traditional public school system today, who has somewhat lost their ability to control the classroom, versus charter education, which has a little bit better history and track record on controlling the classroom. Because if you don't control the classroom, education does not take place.
All right, I'm going to ask you this. This beautiful brochure, which is relatively new, hot off the press, as they say. It says American Classical Charter Academy.
Don't smudge the ink.
Don't smudge the ink, okay. It says here, the mission of the American Classical Charter Academy is to develop within its students a foundation of virtue and knowledge by delivering a rigorous classical liberal arts education with a strong emphasis on the rights and duties of American citizenship. And then, of course, we set the examples here. Educate your child in the same manner as Einstein, Jefferson, Curie, classically, so on and so forth. And education is the greatest gift you give your child. Seating is limited, but your child's potential is not. American Classical Charter School, educating tomorrow's leaders today. Make an appointment. I'm interested here, though, in our 8 pillars of character and our 4 classical virtues. Explain the characters.
Well,
I'm a character and you're a character.
I like the way you covered that, because virtue is really the key. One of the main things that we have at the school is we want to make sure that our students have virtue, they work with their other students, and there's none of the basic problems that they have in the traditional public schools. So we have a little bit stronger control over our students.
You mean to tell me there's discipline?
With the parents. Yeah, absolutely, there's discipline, and this school is not for everybody.
But there's no corporal punishment, right?
No corporal punishment.
Okay.
No, we don't have that. But basically, we once again, that learning triangle with the parent. Parent has to participate, because in a charter school, the parent has to literally go and sign that child up to be in that school. So they have a responsibility when they sign that child up, and obviously they feel they have a responsibility. That's why they brought their child to American Classical Charter Academy, because they like what we have to offer as far as a virtuous citizen is our objective.
Yeah, we have a citizenship. Well, we don't follow citizenship, really. We have a lot of individuals that vote there based on emotion instead of, fact. Knowing the background on how our government was created, okay? What the founding fathers saw in 5,000 years of history in terms of taking the great things and making sure that we were a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. You have these other tenets here, like cooperation, courage, honesty, perseverance, respect, responsibility. Responsibility? Are you kidding? Respect? I think these are lost.
Well, we hope not, because this is what makes a virtuous citizen.
All right, I'm going to conclude this. I want to thank you very much for being here.
Okay. Thank you, George, for having
and espousing these beliefs and everything else, and structuring classical education. Now, let me just ask you this last question. What is the future of classical education? Maybe in Osceola County, if not in the state of Florida or other states.
Well, being in the state of Florida, we're very fortunate. And this is one of the few states in the union where we have actually 5 sets of vouchers. So
I never knew
our
that.
parents have a lot of choices as to where to send their children, number one. As a matter of fact, I saw an article not long ago that says currently 48% of the students who go to school in this state are going to choice schools. Now, that's not just charter. That's charter, that's the Hope Scholarship, all of the different scholarships that they have out there. And there are 5 different formats that they have. So we're very fortunate in this state, and obviously the parents in this state are taking advantage of that. And this is why we've had a loss of about 10 or 11% in the enrollment in our traditional public schools.
All right. Again, I want to thank you for coming here. It was very much appreciated on my part. You're a good man and a good supporter of classical education. And with that, I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, have a good evening, a good day. See you next time.